Mr. Bennett, I need you to confirm something before I continue, the woman from the bank said, her voice suddenly quieter than before. I was standing in my kitchen holding a half-empty mug of coffee, still wearing the same flannel shirt I'd slept in after another rough night with my chest acting up. Sir, did you authorize a withdrawal of $482,000 yesterday morning? I honestly thought she had called the wrong number. I remember laughing once. Just one short laugh. Ma'am, I told her, I worked 41 years at the paper mill. Nobody moves $500,000 out of my retirement account without me knowing. There was silence on the line. Then she said the sentence that made my knees almost give out under me. Your son-in-law was listed as an authorized signer 3 weeks ago. About 20 minutes later, my daughter Emily looked me dead in the eyes across my own dining room table and whispered, Dad, please don't make this harder than it already is. Meanwhile, Derek sat beside her with his arms folded, smiling like he'd already won. You'll never recover that money anyway, he said. Might as well stop embarrassing yourself. If stories like this truly resonate with you, I'd really appreciate you taking a second to like the video and subscribe to the channel, but only if this story speaks to your heart. And before we go any further, tell me where you're watching from and what your local time is right now. I always read those comments late at night when I can't sleep much anymore. My name is Walter Bennett. I'm 72 years old, and this was the week my own family nearly destroyed everything I spent my entire life building. 3 months later, federal agents would walk straight into my son-in-law's brewery while customers were drinking at the bar, and by the end of that afternoon, the same man who laughed at me in my kitchen would be sitting on the sidewalk, crying so hard he could barely breathe. But none of us knew that yet. Back then, all I knew was that my retirement account was gone, my daughter wouldn't look me in the eye anymore, and somehow the man who stole from me still expected me to show up smiling for Sunday dinner. The crazy thing is, I trusted Derek once. That's the part people don't understand. When Emily first brought him home almost 12 years ago, he was the kind of guy who could make a room like him in 5 minutes. Tall, clean haircut, confident handshake, always calling me sir in those early days. He talked about hard work constantly, entrepreneurship, big dreams. I remember one summer cookout in our backyard in Grand Rapids when he stood beside my grill drinking one of those expensive IPA beers and told me, Walter, one day craft breweries are going to be bigger than wineries in Michigan. I laughed and flipped burgers while he kept talking for almost 20 minutes straight about hops and tasting rooms and distribution contracts like he already owned the biggest brewery in the state. Emily adored him. My wife Margaret did too. He's ambitious, she used to say. That's rare nowadays. Maybe she was right. Or maybe ambition and greed just looked similar in the beginning. The first red flag should have been how often Derek talked about money that didn't belong to him. Every holiday somehow turned into a conversation about investments. You know how much dead money sits in retirement accounts? He asked me one Thanksgiving while cutting turkey. People your age should be making that money work. People your age. That phrase always rubbed me wrong, like I was already halfway buried. But I ignored it because Emily seemed happy, and after my first minor heart scare 2 years ago, all I wanted was peace inside my family. Then Derek lost another job. Then another. He always had an explanation. Bad management. Jealous coworkers. Weak leadership. Somehow none of it was ever his fault. But every time he failed somewhere, his brewery dream got bigger. More expensive equipment. Bigger building. More investors. More pressure. One night, he spread blueprints across my dining room table while Margaret served coffee and Emily sat there smiling proudly beside him. This is it, Derek said, tapping the paper with his finger. Bennett Brewing Company. We just need a little startup capital. I still remember the exact feeling in my stomach when he looked directly at me. After saying those words, not at Emily, not at Margaret, me. How much capital? I asked quietly. Derek leaned back in his chair and grinned. Less than what you're sitting on. Margaret immediately looked nervous. Emily reached over and grabbed my hand. Dad, she said softly, this could change all our lives. I should have walked away right there. I know that now. But the truth is, when your own daughter looks at you like she believes you're the last thing standing between her family and happiness, it does something to you. Especially at my age. Especially when you've spent your whole life believing family comes before everything else. What I didn't know yet was that Derek had already been planning something long before that dinner ever happened. and hidden inside a stack of harmless-looking paperwork was one signature that would eventually give him access to almost every dollar I had left in this world. Emily was always the soft one when she was little. At least that is what everybody used to say. She had those big blue eyes like her mother and this habit of wrapping both hands around my arm whenever she wanted something. Even when she was 8 years old, she already knew how to melt people. I remember one winter in 1999 when money was tight and the transmission died in our old Ford pickup 2 weeks before Christmas. I was working double shifts at the paper mill back then, sometimes 14 hours straight, and Margaret kept telling the kids we needed to cut back that year. My son Adam understood immediately. Emily did not. She came into the kitchen holding a Toys R Us catalog folded open to a shiny silver karaoke machine that cost almost $300. "Daddy," she said, climbing into my lap while I ate reheated chili at midnight. "Santa already knows I want this one." Margaret gave me that look from across the kitchen table. The look that meant do not disappoint her. I still remember Adam quietly staring down into his cereal while Emily kept smiling at me like she already knew the answer. 2 days later, I picked up an extra Saturday shift and bought the machine anyway. Adam got a Detroit Lions sweatshirt and a $20 flashlight set that Christmas. He never complained once. Looking back now, I think that was the beginning of something none of us noticed. Emily always got protected from consequences. Even in high school, if she missed curfew, Margaret blamed the weather. If she wrecked her first car backing into a mailbox, somehow the mailbox was placed too close to the road. Meanwhile, Adam got grounded for forgetting to mow the lawn one time. "Your sister is sensitive," Margaret used to tell him. "You are tougher." Funny how families convince themselves favoritism is love. When Emily met Derek at Michigan State, she called Margaret crying after their third date because he showed up on a motorcycle during a thunderstorm with flowers soaked in rainwater. Margaret thought it was romantic. I thought it sounded reckless. But from the second Derek entered our family, Emily treated him like he could do no wrong. One Easter Sunday about 6 years ago, Derek showed up nearly 2 hours late wearing sunglasses indoors and carrying expensive steaks like he was hosting the meal instead of attending it. "Sorry I am late, Walter," he said loudly while tossing the meat onto the counter. Some of us still work for a living. Adam almost choked on his drink when he heard that. I saw Margaret tense up immediately because she knew exactly how disrespectful it sounded, but before I could even respond, Emily jumped in first. "Oh my God, Dad, he was joking." Derek smirked and opened a beer right there in my kitchen before dinner even started. "You old guys are too sensitive," he said. Adam muttered. "Or maybe you just think acting like an idiot is charming." The entire room went silent after that. Emily instantly turned on her brother. "Why are you always attacking Derek?" she snapped. "You have hated him since day one." Adam looked at me waiting for me to say something, but Margaret shook her head slightly at him like she was begging him not to start a fight on Easter. So once again, everybody swallowed what they really felt just to keep Emily happy. That became the pattern for years. Derek borrowed tools and returned them broken. Emily defended him. Derek skipped family dinners unless he needed something. Emily defended him. Derek constantly talked down to people, especially older folks, like anybody over 60 was already outdated equipment waiting to be thrown away. Emily defended him every single time. The worst part was how slowly it all happened. Families do not usually explode overnight. They crack quietly for years while everybody pretends the sound is normal. About 8 months before my retirement money disappeared, Derek came over alone one afternoon while Margaret was at her cardiology appointment. He walked through my garage staring at my old woodworking tools before finally saying, "You know, Walter, your generation had it easy." I laughed because I honestly thought he was kidding. "Easy?" I asked. "I worked swing shifts for 4 decades. Derek leaned against my workbench and shrugged. "Yeah, but guys your age could actually retire. People my age are drowning." Something about the way he said it made my stomach tighten. Not angry, not emotional, calculating. Then his eyes drifted toward the file cabinet where I kept all our retirement paperwork locked away. "Honestly," he said casually, "most people your age just sit on money until they die." I remember staring at him for a second longer than normal after that, because for the first time since meeting him, I suddenly had the strange feeling he was not looking at me like family anymore. He was looking at me like an opportunity. About 3 months after that conversation in my garage, something happened that changed the atmosphere inside our family almost overnight. I received a letter from the paper mill inviting me to a retirement recognition banquet in downtown Grand Rapids. Normally, I would have skipped something like that. I had spent most of my life avoiding attention. But this one mattered because they were honoring the last group of workers from the old generation before the plant fully automated part of the operation. 41 years on the floor. 41 winters driving through lake-effect snow at 4:30 in the morning. 41 years breathing steam and machine oil while trying to build a stable life for my family. Margaret cried when she read the invitation. "Walter," she said softly, touching my arm at the kitchen counter. "They are finally recognizing everything you gave that place." Even Adam drove in from Lansing for the banquet. Emily and Derek came too, though Derek spent most of the evening talking to strangers near the open bar instead of sitting with the family. The ballroom overlooked the Grand River, and for the first time in years I actually felt proud of myself. Not rich, not important, just proud. One by one they called retirees onto the stage, and when they announced my name, the room applauded louder than I expected. A few younger workers even stood up. My old supervisor, Hank, shook my hand and laughed into the microphone. Walter Bennett fixed more broken machines than the maintenance department ever did. Everybody laughed. Even I did. Then they handed me a framed plaque and a retirement bonus check that honestly surprised me. $35,000. I stared at it for a second because I truly had not expected that amount. Margaret squeezed my hand under the table. "Maybe we finally take that Maine trip," she whispered. Derek noticed the check immediately. I saw it happen. His whole expression changed for half a second before the smile came back. Later that night at dinner, he would not stop talking about opportunity. "This is exactly what I mean," he said while cutting into a steak at the restaurant afterward. "Guys like Walter know how to build things. You just need younger people around you willing to take risks." Adam rolled his eyes. Funny how every conversation somehow turns into Derek needing money. Emily immediately snapped back. "Why are you always so negative?" Derek leaned back, smiling like he enjoyed watching the tension grow. "I am not asking for anything," he said calmly. "I am talking about investment. Big difference." I normally would have stayed quiet right there. That had always been my role in the family. Keep the peace. Swallow irritation. Let everybody else cool off. But something about the way Derek kept staring at that retirement check finally got under my skin. "You seem awfully interested in my finances lately," I said. The table went silent so fast you could hear dishes clinking from the kitchen across the restaurant. Emily looked stunned. Margaret slowly lowered her fork. Derek gave a short laugh. "Walter, come on." "No," I said quietly. "I mean it. Every time we talk, somehow my retirement comes up." Derek's smile tightened just a little. "I am trying to help you think bigger." "I am 72, I replied. "Thinking bigger is not exactly my priority anymore." Adam nearly smiled into his drink after hearing that, but Emily looked embarrassed. "Dad, he is just trying to include you in something exciting." Derek leaned forward then, lowering his voice. "Look, all I am saying is people respect money that moves. Sitting on savings your whole life just to die with it is pointless." That sentence hit me harder than I expected. Not because it was rude, because it sounded rehearsed. Like he had already spent months convincing himself my money belonged somewhere else. For the first time, I noticed how often Emily watched him before speaking, almost checking his reactions before forming her own opinions. Even Margaret seemed uncomfortable now. On the drive home, she stared out the passenger window quietly while rain tapped against the windshield. Finally, she whispered, "Did tonight feel strange to you?" I kept both hands on the steering wheel. "Yeah," I admitted. "It did." But what neither of us understood yet was that Derek had already started laying the groundwork for something much bigger behind our backs. And within weeks, my daughter would ask me to sign paperwork that she promised was only a formality. The paperwork showed up on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in early October. I remember because the maple tree in our front yard had just started dropping red leaves across the driveway, and Margaret was inside making tomato soup while an old Frank Sinatra song played softly from the kitchen radio. Emily arrived alone, carrying a leather folder against her chest like she was nervous about something. "Dad," she said the second she walked in, "can I ask you a favor?" That sentence right there has probably ruined more families than people realize. I told her to sit down, and for a few minutes, she acted almost unusually sweet. Asking about my blood pressure, asking whether Margaret needed anything from the grocery store, smiling too much. Then she finally slid the folder across the table toward me. It is just temporary paperwork, she explained quickly. The investors for Derek's brewery need proof that family support exists behind the business. I frowned immediately. Why would they need me involved? Emily sighed dramatically like I was making things difficult already. Dad, nobody is taking your money. Then why am I signing anything? I asked. She opened the folder and pointed to highlighted sections with perfectly manicured fingernails. It is basically symbolic. They just want to show the bank that Derek has stable backing from family assets. Family assets. Even hearing the phrase made me uncomfortable. Margaret walked in carrying bowls of soup and glanced at the paperwork. What kind of forms are these? Emily answered before I could. Just authorization documents tied to investment credibility. That sounded polished. Rehearsed. I realized now Derek had probably coached her word for word beforehand. I flipped through page after page covered in legal language that made my eyes hurt. Loan references. Equity statements. Temporary authorizations. Half the words meant nothing to me. I need time to read this, I said finally. Emily's entire expression changed. The warmth disappeared almost instantly. Dad, the meeting with the investors is tomorrow morning. Then they can wait, I replied. She leaned back in her chair, frustrated now. You always do this. Do what? Act like people are trying to scam you every time somebody asks for help. Margaret quietly stepped in then. Emily, your father just wants to understand what he is signing. But Emily shook her head hard. No, Mom. This is exactly why Derek says my family never believes in him. My family, not our family. I noticed that immediately. Then came the guilt. Fast and sharp. Do you know how humiliating it is, Emily said, watching my husband beg strangers for support while my own father sits on enough savings to change our lives? That one hurt. Not because it was true, because she knew exactly where to aim it. Margaret reached for my hand under the table. Walter, she whispered carefully, maybe we should at least hear Derek out. I stared at my wife in disbelief for a second. Even she was starting to bend under the pressure now. That night Derek came over carrying expensive whiskey like he was closing a business deal instead of talking to family. He spread brewery designs across the dining room table while speaking with this smooth confidence that made everything sound reasonable. The location is incredible, he said. Right near the riverfront. Foot traffic alone could make this place explode. He kept talking numbers. Growth projections. Investors. Expansion plans. Every sentence sounded bigger than the last. Then finally he lowered his voice and looked directly at me. Walter, this is not charity. This is legacy. Legacy. Another rehearsed word. I am not risking my retirement, I told him flatly. Derek nodded slowly like he expected resistance. Nobody is asking you to. Then he slid a single paper closer toward me. This just gives temporary authorization while financing clears. Emily immediately added, Dad, please. You know we would never hurt you. Margaret looked exhausted sitting there between us all. I could see she wanted peace more than caution. Adam was the only person not there that night, and suddenly I wished he had been. I kept reading the document while everybody watched me in silence. The pressure in that room felt unbearable, for pairs of eyes waiting for me to stop being difficult. Finally, Derek smiled softly and said, Trust your family, Walter. And against every instinct screaming in my chest, I picked up the pen. The moment the tip touched the paper, I had this strange feeling deep in my stomach that something irreversible had just happened. For almost 2 weeks after I signed those documents, nothing happened. At least nothing obvious. Life kept moving in that quiet middle-class rhythm Margaret and I had built over decades. Grocery runs on Thursdays. Church on Sundays. Coffee at 6 every morning while the neighborhood stayed dark and silent outside our kitchen window. Part of me even started wondering if maybe I had overreacted. Maybe Derek really was trying to build something legitimate. Maybe I had let my age make me suspicious. Then the calls from the bank started. The first one came while I was replacing a loose fence board in the backyard. Mr. Bennett, the woman on the phone said carefully, we noticed several unusually large transfers connected to your retirement portfolio. My stomach tightened instantly. What kind of transfers? There was a pause. Sir, according to our records, authorization was already approved through shared account permissions. Shared account permissions. I nearly dropped the cordless drill onto the grass. I drove to the bank less than 20 minutes later with my hands shaking so badly I missed a stop sign near Fulton Street. The young man sitting behind the desk could not have been older than 26. He wore one of those tight blue suits younger bankers always seem to wear now. He clicked through screens for nearly 10 minutes before finally looking up at me with visible discomfort. "Mr. Bennett," he said quietly, "the majority of the account has already been distributed." "Distributed where?" I asked. "Business development accounts, equipment acquisitions, commercial property escrow." I stared at him blankly because none of those words sounded real to me yet. "How much is left?" He swallowed hard before turning the monitor slightly toward me. I still remember the exact number glowing on that screen. $28,411. That was all. 41 years reduced to numbers small enough to fit inside one line of a computer monitor. I called Emily from the parking lot immediately. Straight to voicemail. I called again. Then again. Nothing. I texted her, "Please call me now." 10 minutes later, she finally replied with only 4 words. "In a meeting right now." I drove directly to their condo downtown anyway. Derek's black pickup truck was parked outside beside a brand new stainless steel brewing tank sitting on a flatbed trailer. I remember staring at that tank, realizing exactly where my money had gone. Emily opened the door looking irritated before I even spoke. "Dad, you cannot just show up like this." "What did you do?" I asked her. My voice barely sounded like mine anymore. Derek appeared behind her holding a beer bottle, even though it was not even 3 in the afternoon. "Relax, Walter," he said casually. "Everything is under control. You emptied my retirement account." Emily immediately crossed her arms. "It was an investment." "Investment?" I snapped. "That money was supposed to keep your mother and me alive." Derek actually sighed like I was inconveniencing him. "You signed the authorization forms. You lied to me about what they were." "No," he replied calmly. "You just did not bother reading them carefully." That sentence hit harder than any shouting could have. Emily stepped in again before I could respond. "Dad, we talked about this already." "No," I said, staring at her in disbelief. "You talked. I trusted you." I spent the next several days trying everything I could think of. I called the bank manager 3 separate times. I emailed copies of the paperwork to a lawyer Adam recommended. I even wrote Derek an actual handwritten letter asking him to meet privately and work out a repayment plan before things got worse. He never answered the letter. Emily finally sent me a text at nearly midnight 3 days later. "Derek says legal threats are only making this uglier." Legal threats? As if I was the aggressor now. Then little by little the rest of the family started hearing Derek and Emily's version first. My sister Carol called one evening and awkwardly asked, "Walter, did you knowingly invest in the brewery and then change your mind?" Even church friends began treating me strangely. One older couple stopped talking when Margaret and I walked into the fellowship hall after Sunday service. Somehow the story spreading around town had turned into me sabotaging my own daughter's future because I regretted helping them. Derek controlled the narrative before I even understood there was a war happening. And the worst part was watching Margaret slowly break under the stress. One night, I found her sitting alone in the dark living room holding unpaid medical bills in her lap, while the television flickered silently in front of her. "Maybe we should just let it go," she whispered without looking at me. That was the moment I realized I was completely alone. That winter felt longer than any winter I could remember in Michigan. The kind where the sky stays gray for weeks straight, and the cold somehow seeps into your bones, even inside the house. Margaret stopped sleeping well after everything happened. I would wake up around 3 in the morning and find her sitting at the kitchen table wrapped in a blanket, staring at old family photos with the stove light on. Sometimes she would not even realize I was standing there. One night, I poured her a cup of tea and sat beside her quietly. She touched a picture of Emily from high school graduation and whispered, "I keep wondering where we went wrong." I did not know how to answer that question anymore. The medical bills kept coming. Prescription costs, cardiology visits, follow-up scans insurance barely covered. I started picking up small repair jobs around the neighborhood just to keep extra money coming in. At 72 years old, I was fixing garage doors and replacing water heaters for people half my age while my son-in-law posted brewery updates online like some local celebrity entrepreneur. Every time I opened social media, there was another smiling photo of Derek standing beside stainless steel tanks holding craft beer glasses with investors. Emily appeared in every picture beside him, looking happier than I had seen her in years. One Friday afternoon, Margaret quietly asked me if we should sell the lake cabin her father left us 30 years ago. I nearly dropped the wrench I was holding. No, I said immediately. That cabin stays in the family. She nodded slowly but did not argue. That was what scared me most. Margaret had stopped fighting for things. Around that same time, Adam started visiting more often. He never said I told you so. Not once. Which honestly made me trust him even more. One evening, he came over carrying takeout containers from a barbecue place near his office, and the three of us sat in silence for a while listening to snow hit the windows. Finally, Adam looked at me carefully and said, "Dad, something about Derek's numbers does not make sense." I frowned. "What numbers?" "The brewery projections Emily posted online." He pulled out his phone and showed me a fundraiser page Derek had shared publicly. Half the promises listed there sounded impossible. Expansion plans, distribution targets, revenue forecasts that looked absurd for a startup operation barely open yet. "This reads like fantasy," Adam muttered. Margaret immediately looked nervous. "Please," she whispered. "I cannot handle more fighting." Adam lowered his voice. "Mom, I am not trying to upset you. I just think Dad needs to understand something." Then he looked directly at me. "People like Derek survive because everybody keeps treating him like family instead of treating him like a businessman." That sentence stayed with me for days afterward. Because deep down I realized Adam was right. I had spent months reacting emotionally while Derek operated strategically. He used guilt like leverage, optimism like camouflage, family loyalty like a contract nobody else was allowed to question. And somehow, every time I defended myself, I looked like the unreasonable one. A week later, Emily finally came over alone for the first time in months. Margaret lit up the second she walked through the door, but I noticed Emily barely hugged her mother before sitting down. She looked exhausted, older somehow. "Derek is stressed," she said quietly while stirring untouched coffee. "The brewery launch has been overwhelming." I stared at her in disbelief. "Emily, your mother is rationing medication because of what happened." Her eyes immediately hardened again. "You act like Derek wanted things to spiral this far. He took everything we had." "No," she snapped suddenly. "You gave it to him." The room went dead silent after that. Margaret looked down at the table. Emily instantly realized how cold she sounded, but instead of apologizing, she grabbed her purse and stood up. "I just came because Mom asked me to," she muttered. Then she left. I remember standing at the front window watching her taillights disappear through falling snow while Margaret cried quietly behind me in the kitchen. And for the first time since all of this started, something inside me changed. Not anger, not revenge, clarity. Because I finally understood these people were never planning to fix what they had done. They were simply waiting for me to get tired enough to stop fighting. But 3 nights later, while sorting through old bank statements at the dining room table, I noticed a transaction date that did not match the paperwork I signed, and suddenly my exhaustion disappeared. The transaction date on the statement was 4 days earlier than the authorization form I signed. I checked it 3 times under the dining room light because I honestly thought my eyes were failing me. But the numbers stayed the same. Funds had already started moving before my signature existed. That was the first real crack in Derek's story. Not suspicion, proof. The next morning I drove to the public library downtown because our home printer barely worked anymore and I needed copies made. I sat there for nearly 2 hours printing transaction histories, bank records, and screenshots while college kids whispered over laptops around me. I remember feeling strangely calm for the first time in months. Like my brain had finally stopped drowning in emotion long enough to notice facts. When I got home, Margaret found me organizing papers across the dining room table in neat piles. "Walter," she asked carefully, "what are you doing?" "Looking," I replied. "Really looking." She stood there quietly for a moment before saying something that surprised me. "Good." That afternoon I called the bank again, but this time I asked for internal authorization logs instead of explanations. The manager sounded less patient than before. "Mr. Bennett, all approvals appear valid." "Then send me timestamps," I said. Silence. "Excuse me. Every signature, every transfer, every authorization entry. I want all of it." I could almost hear him realizing I was no longer calling as a confused old man trying to undo a bad decision. After hanging up, I drove over to Adam's house in Lansing carrying a cardboard box full of documents. His wife Rachel opened the door and immediately said, "You look exhausted." "I probably am," I admitted. Adam spent nearly 4 hours at his kitchen table going through paperwork with me. Highlighters everywhere. Coffee cups stacked beside us. At one point, he suddenly stopped flipping pages and looked up slowly. Dad, this account number here does not belong to the brewery. What do you mean? Look. He pointed at a transfer line connected to an LLC neither of us recognized. North Coast Holdings Group. The transaction date on the statement was 4 days earlier than the authorization form I signed. I checked it 3 times under the dining room light because I honestly thought my eyes were failing me. But the numbers stayed the same. Funds had already started moving before my signature existed. That was the first real crack in Derek's story. Not suspicion. Proof. The next morning I drove to the public library downtown because our home printer barely worked anymore and I needed copies made. I sat there for nearly 2 hours printing transaction histories, bank records, and screenshots while college kids whispered over laptops around me. I remember feeling strangely calm for the first time in months. Like my brain had finally stopped drowning in emotion long enough to notice facts. When I got home, Margaret found me organizing papers across the dining room table in neat piles. Walter, she asked carefully, what are you doing? Looking, I replied. Really looking. She stood there quietly for a moment before saying something that surprised me. Good. That afternoon I called the bank again, but this time I asked for internal authorization logs instead of explanations. The manager sounded less patient than before. Mr. Bennett, all approvals appear valid. Then send me timestamps, I said. Silence. Excuse me. Every signature. Every transfer. Every authorization entry. I want all of it. I could almost hear him realizing I was no longer calling as a confused old man trying to undo a bad decision. After hanging up, I drove over to Adam's house in Lansing carrying a cardboard box full of documents. His wife Rachel opened the door and immediately said, "You look exhausted." I probably am, I admitted. Adam spent nearly 4 hours at his kitchen table going through paperwork with me. Highlighters everywhere. Coffee cups stacked beside us. At one point he suddenly stopped flipping pages and looked up slowly. Dad, this account number here does not belong to the brewery. What do you mean? Look. He pointed at a transfer line connected to an LLC neither of us recognized. North Coast Holdings Group. Dahet Thoi John Cho Gue Tin Nan. Vui Long Thursday Lai. Thursday Lai? By the time spring came back to Grand Rapids, everything looked different even though the city itself had not changed at all. The river still carried chunks of melting ice past the old brick buildings downtown. College kids still packed the sidewalks on Friday nights. But for the first time in nearly a year, I was no longer waking up every morning feeling helpless. Quiet changes had started happening behind the scenes. Small ones at first. A call returned faster than expected. A banker suddenly sounding nervous instead of dismissive. An accountant asking for additional records I had not originally provided. Nobody explained much directly, but after months of being ignored, I could finally feel the balance shifting. Derek, on the other hand, seemed more confident than ever. His brewery had officially opened 2 months earlier, and people in town treated it like the newest local success story. Every weekend social media filled with photos of packed tables, live music, food trucks parked outside, and Derek standing behind the bar laughing with customers like some self-made businessman who built everything from scratch. One Saturday morning, Adam came over carrying coffee and set his phone down in front of me at the kitchen table. "Look at this," he muttered. Derek had posted a video announcing plans for a second location already. Margaret watched silently from the stove while the video played. Derek raised a glass toward the camera and said, "When people doubt your vision, success becomes the best answer." Then the crowd behind him started cheering. I expected rage when I watched that clip. But strangely, I felt calm instead. Calm enough that it unsettled even me. Adam noticed immediately. "You okay?" he asked carefully. I nodded once. "Yeah," I said quietly. "I think I finally am." A few days later, I received a voicemail from a man named Richard Lawson who introduced himself as a forensic financial consultant connected to one of the agencies reviewing my complaint. His voice was calm and professional. "Mr. Bennett," he said, "we would like to schedule an in-person meeting regarding several discrepancies connected to transferred retirement assets and associated business filings." Discrepancies. That word sat in my chest all afternoon. Not misunderstandings. Not family disagreements. Discrepancies. Real ones. The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday inside a federal office building near downtown. I did not tell Margaret much beforehand because I did not want to raise hopes too early. She had already been through enough disappointment. But the night before the meeting, she stopped me while I folded laundry in the bedroom and quietly asked, "Do you think somebody finally believes you?" I looked at her for a long moment before answering. I think somebody finally looked closely. Thursday morning arrived cold and windy. I wore the same gray suit from my retirement banquet because it was the only decent one I still owned. The waiting room inside the building smelled like old coffee and printer paper. Men in dark jackets walked quickly through the hallways carrying folders thick with documents. Nobody smiled much there. Nobody wasted words. A younger woman escorted me into a conference room where two men were already sitting at a long table covered with binders and printed bank statements. One introduced himself as Special Agent Collins. The other simply said, "Richard Lawson." They shook my hand firmly, but did not offer sympathy. Somehow that made me trust them more. Richard opened a folder and slid several pages toward me. "Before we continue," he said calmly, "we need to confirm whether you personally authorized these transactions on the dates listed." I adjusted my glasses and started reading. The deeper I looked, the colder my hands became. There were signatures attached to transfers I had never seen before. Authorization timestamps connected to hours when I was not even near a computer. One withdrawal had apparently occurred while Margaret and I were attending church Christmas service. Another happened during a cardiology appointment across town. Special Agent Collins watched my expression carefully without interrupting. Finally, he asked, "Mr. Bennett, do you recognize any of this activity?" I looked down at the stack of documents spread across the table, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I realized the people sitting across from me already knew far more than Derek ever imagined. The call came on a Thursday afternoon just after lunch. I was repairing a cabinet hinge in the garage when my phone buzzed with Emily's name across the screen. For a second, I simply stared at it. She had barely called me directly in months. "Dad." Her voice sounded tight. Panicked. "What did you do?" I wiped my hands slowly with an old shop rag before answering. "That depends what you mean." I heard muffled voices behind her and the sound of a door slamming somewhere nearby. "Federal agents came to the brewery this morning," she whispered. "They shut everything down." I closed my eyes briefly but kept my voice steady. "I see. Do not do that," she snapped suddenly. "Do not act calm like you did not know this was coming." Before I could answer, Derek grabbed the phone from her. I recognized his breathing immediately. Fast. Angry. "You went behind our backs," he said. "You brought investigators into this." The call came on a Thursday afternoon just after lunch. I was repairing a cabinet hinge in the garage when my phone buzzed with Emily's name across the screen. For a second, I simply stared at it. She had barely called me directly in months. "Dad." Her voice sounded tight. Panicked. "What did you do?" I wiped my hands slowly with an old shop rag before answering. "That depends what you mean." I heard muffled voices behind her and the sound of a door slamming somewhere nearby. "Federal agents came to the brewery this morning," she whispered. "They shut everything down." I closed my eyes briefly but kept my voice steady. "I see. Do not do that," she snapped suddenly. "Do not act calm like you did not know this was coming." Before I could answer, Derek grabbed the phone from her. I recognized his breathing immediately. Fast. Angry. "You went behind our backs," he said. "You brought investigators into this." The het thoi John Cho Gue Tin Nan. Vui Long Thursday Lie. Thursday Lie. The strange thing about peace is that when it finally comes back into your life, it does not arrive loudly. There are no fireworks. No dramatic music playing somewhere in the background. Most of the time, it arrives quietly on an ordinary morning while you are standing in your kitchen pouring coffee and realizing your hands are no longer shaking. About 11 months after federal investigators froze the brewery accounts, Margaret and I drove north to the lake cabin for the first time in nearly 2 years. The legal process had taken months. Derek eventually accepted a settlement agreement tied to financial fraud investigations and civil liability claims. Several investors sued him separately after investigators uncovered falsified reporting connected to the brewery's early financing. Emily left Michigan for a while after everything collapsed. We still speak occasionally now, carefully, slowly, like two people learning a new language after forgetting how to trust each other. Some wounds do not fully disappear. They simply stop bleeding every day. Financially, Margaret and I survived better than I once feared we would. Not because everything was restored perfectly, but because I stopped measuring my worth by what had been taken from me. That was the real change. The cabin looked smaller when we arrived that first weekend back, but somehow warmer too. The old wooden dock still creaked under our feet exactly the way it did 20 years earlier when the kids used to jump into the lake while I grilled hamburgers nearby. Margaret stood on the porch wrapped in a sweater watching the sunset turn the water orange and gold. "It still feels like home," she whispered. I nodded slowly because for a long time I honestly thought we had lost this place too. That night we sat beside a small fire pit while crickets hummed through the trees around us. No phones ringing. No lawyers calling. No panic sitting in my chest. Just quiet. Real quiet. I think people underestimate how valuable peace becomes after chaos. Adam visits often now, more than he used to. One evening while helping me repair part of the dock railing, he suddenly said, "Dad, you know none of this was your fault, right?" I kept tightening a bolt for a second before answering. "I know that now." And I meant it. Because for months after everything happened, I blamed myself more than I blamed Derek. I kept replaying every decision, every signature, every warning sign I ignored. But age teaches you something eventually. Good people are often easier to manipulate because they assume love comes with limits. They assume family would never intentionally destroy them. Sometimes wisdom is learning that boundaries are not cruelty. Boundaries are protection. If you are listening to this right now, while somebody in your own life keeps draining your peace, your finances, your confidence, or your identity little by little, I want you to hear me clearly. Trust your instincts earlier than I did. Pay attention when somebody constantly pressures you to feel guilty for protecting yourself. Read every document carefully. Ask hard questions. Slow things down. People who truly love you will never punish you for wanting clarity. And most importantly, do not let anybody convince you that kindness means surrendering your dignity. It does not. I also learned something else through all this. Sometimes God, or life, or whatever you personally believe in, allows painful truths to surface because the version of you living before the betrayal was surviving on illusions. I used to think keeping peace inside the family meant staying silent no matter what happened. Now I understand peace built on silence is not peace at all. It is fear wearing polite clothes. My name is Walter Bennett. I am 72 years old, and the core lesson I want to leave with you is this. Never hand someone the keys to your life simply because they share your last name. These days, Margaret and I spend most mornings sitting on the porch with coffee watching birds move across the lake while the world slowly wakes up around us. Sometimes she reads beside me while I work on old fishing lures in the garage. Last fall, Adam gave me a small wooden sign he carved himself. It hangs above the cabin door now. 3 simple words burned into the wood. Protect your peace. I look at that sign every single morning before stepping outside, and honestly, after everything that happened, I think that might be the richest I have felt in years. Thank you for staying with me through this story. Truly, if any part of it spoke to your own experiences, I hope it reminded you that losing yourself is not the end of your story. Sometimes it is the beginning of finally seeing clearly. And if you want, you can leave a comment sharing where you are watching from or what lesson this story left with you. I read far more of those comments than people probably realize. You can also subscribe if you enjoy stories like this because there are many more waiting in this playlist. Stories about family, betrayal, survival, second chances, and the quiet ways ordinary people rebuild themselves after life breaks apart. Some of those stories are heartbreaking. Some are healing. But all of them remind us that no matter how dark things become, there is still a path forward for people willing to keep going.